Good morning and welcome to the second day of the Hancock Symposium. I want to thank all of you for the great day we had yesterday, all the positive energy, and especially thanks to our great students for making our guests feel so welcome. We're going to jump right into the second plenary session right now. And to do that, I would like to introduce Dr. Heather McRae. Dr. McRae is, we're very fortunate to have her as a visiting professor here at Westminster, and she's the perfect person to introduce our speaker this morning. Dr. McRae began her education at Furman University, a place very much like Westminster, and she clearly learned to value her liberal arts education. She completed her PhD in medieval history, and Islamic history is actually one of her areas of specialization. Some of you will remember her from the 2012 symposium when she gave a talk right here on Christianity and Islam and the idea of just war. And since that time, she has consistently taught on aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian geographical region. And she actually taught a course just last spring entitled Travel Tales in the Islamic World. So she knows a lot about this region, knows a lot about this topic, and it's our great privilege to have her to introduce our speaker. So I'd like to welcome and join me in welcoming Dr. Heather McRae.
Good morning, and thank you to Dr. Perry for that kind introduction. In Germany, your PhD advisor is known as your doctor father. Because this plenary speaker is my PhD advisor's brother, it means that I'm lucky enough to be able to claim him as a sort of intellectual uncle, and I'm honored to introduce him. George P. Smith was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2018 for his work on phage display of peptides and antibodies. This award was the culmination of a career that began with a doctorate in bacteriology and immunology from Harvard in 1970 and continued through positions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Duke University, as well as a long and distinguished career at the University of Missouri in Columbia. However, Dr. Smith's interests reach far beyond biology and chemistry. He believes there's an obligation for everyone to pay attention to issues affecting the peoples of the world. In particular, he has been active in focusing both national and international public attention on human rights issues, especially in the Levant. To put it in a historical framework, because I am, after all, a historian, in Dr. Smith's interest in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, I hear echoes of the work of Ralph Bunche. Dr. Bunche, another Harvard PhD, in 1950 was the first African American to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel organization notes that Bunche received it for having arranged a ceasefire between Israelis and Arabs during the war which followed the creation of the State of Israel. The fact that so many Nobel laureates since Ralph Bunche have engaged with this area of the Middle East speaks to its complicated and long history. Because it's a geographical crossroads, the land currently in question has been over the millennia a part of or controlled by ancient Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Phoenicia, the Assyrian Empire, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, Babylonia, 3 Persian empires, 2 Greek empires, 3 versions of the Roman Empire, 3 caliphates, the Seljuk Turks, the Crusader states, the Ottoman Empire, and the UK as a mandate after World War I ended the Ottoman Empire. All of this was followed by the founding of Israel in 1948. To further complicate this long history, Jerusalem is also a center of spiritual geography for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In tackling the current state of this part of the world, George Smith has embraced the idea of the public intellectual, as a man engaged more deeply and broadly in his world, looking far beyond the walls of his laboratories. Perhaps his point of view might best be explained by an editor of the New York Times Book Review in 2008. For true public intellectuals, the editor notes, at the most fundamental level, ideas for them were not building blocks to a career. Rather, careers were the material foundation that allowed them to define and express their ideas. By creating a continuity of intellectual inquiry, both in and outside of his laboratories, our next speaker embodies this ideal of a life defined by ideas in active engagement with the world. Please help me welcome George P. Smith.
I hope you won't mind if I start by disrobing. So, I'm going to show off this wonderful shirt. And I would really like to put a shout out to Jennifer Litherland, who made this wonderful program. This is a really graceful and as well as functional piece of art. So thank you very much for doing that. Oh, I didn't really mean it that way. Sorry, is Edwina Sands in the audience? Well, okay, well, maybe I'm off the hook. No, I don't intend that one. I'm really going to be talking about some other walls in Palestine which haven't yet been torn down and which I think need to be torn down. And that's what I meant by this. I didn't actually realize that there could be that meaning to this. This is Palestine, from November 30th, 1947 to the spring of 1949, a catastrophe happened to Palestine, a Nakba in Arabic, and that's the term I'm going to use for it. During that period, more than half the Palestinian Arab indigenous people of Palestine were expelled from the part of Palestine that was to become Israel, that light color. They were expelled from their land. In fact, it's 83% of the Palestinian Arabs that lived in the part that was to become Israel were expelled. They were expelled in order to make way for a Jewish state with a large Jewish majority. The Jewish forces were led by a government, by a leadership, and ultimately a government that was subscribed to a philosophy called Zionism. And Zionism's core principle is that Palestine belongs to the Jewish people, that the Jewish people need to have sovereignty over Palestine, and there needs to be a large Jewish majority in Palestine. And the Jewish fighters were the great majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them were recent European immigrants, and including some Holocaust survivors. And so they were a foreign force that expelled the native population. That's what we refer to as the Nakba. You can imagine that this expulsion had huge human consequences. This is an aerial photograph of the city of Alida, taken in 1932, and just before the Nakba, it had a population of almost 20,000 people. The city just below it is Ramle, and it had a population slightly larger. And those two cities were depopulated. Their population was expelled. By the way, Alida, if you have flown into Israel, you've landed there. It's now has the Hebraized name of Lod. That's where Ben Gurion Airport is. Looting of those two cities, altogether there were 50,000 people expelled from those two cities together. This is a picture of what's called the Lida Death March, of the people, the expelled people, walking on foot with whatever they could carry on their back, mostly to the West Bank that was controlled by Jordan. And so this is like a Palestinian Cherokee Trail of Tears, you might say. Looting of those two cities began immediately after the expulsion of their populations. 50,000 people altogether, taking the two cities together. This is a map of the Nakba. It has been the lifetime work of Salman Abu Sita. He was 10 years old during the Nakba. He lived, his village was close to the Gaza Strip, and he witnessed his village being depopulated, and his family and the families from all the neighboring villages were expelled into the Gaza Strip. So this is a map. This is his map of all this on the left-hand side, a red dot on all the villages and towns, Palestinian villages and towns that were depopulated and mostly destroyed in the course of the Nakba. On the right-hand side are the Palestinian towns and villages that remain, that weren't depopulated or destroyed. One of them is Nazareth, a Christian plus Muslim city, a large city, and that was not depopulated because the then Israeli officer in charge of the attack against that city refused to obey orders and ensure the expulsion of the population. This is the Nakba. The Nakba, as you can see, was incomplete. There's a part of Palestine, the West Bank on the right, that large white area on the right, and then that tiny little Gaza Strip on the left that weren't depopulated. And that's because there was some resistance to the Nakba. There was almost no resistance on the part of the Palestinian people themselves. And that's because 10 years before, they had revolted. They had revolted against the British rule, and as Heather said, Britain actually was the ruler of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate after the First World War. They were revolting against British rule and against the Zionist project, which they realized was coming and had the intention of dispossessing them of their land. And that revolt was put down brutally by the British military with the help of Zionist militias. So the military capabilities of the Palestine people themselves were liquidated 10 years before. But armies from neighboring Arab countries, Arab dictatorships, did invade about halfway through the Nakba, when already about 250,000 Palestinians had already been expelled. So when the British left, the last British troops left in May 15th of 1948, they invaded, and there was one army that was very effective, and that was the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion. It was led by British officers, and the Zionist forces did not want to mess with them. They made a secret agreement with King Abdallah, the grandfather of the present king of Jordan, and so that the Zionists agreed they wouldn't attack in the West Bank, and the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, agreed that they would not venture outside the West Bank. Jordan coveted the West Bank for itself. So that's why the West Bank was not conquered. This is the Nakba. Immediately after the Nakba, the Zionist forces were deployed to the borders in order to prevent the expelled Palestinian people from returning to their homes. Already in a period of a few months, the Palestinian people who had been indigenous to that region for well over a millennium were now foreigners. They were called infiltrators. And the Zionist forces were very effective at keeping infiltrators out. A few got through. Most of them, in the first few months, went back to maybe harvest their crops or get money that they had hidden in their homes. Their homes mostly were destroyed, but they might have been in the basement, so few of them managed to get some money and valuables and return back up to Lebanon or to the West Bank or to Syria with whatever they could salvage from their destroyed villages. That's been called the border wars. It's complicated, you know? I mean, Heather just said it's complicated. Of course it's complicated. Any human activity is complicated. But is that complication mean that we can't be appalled at this crime against humanity? I just don't think so. I don't think it requires a lifetime of professional study of the Nakba in order to be appalled by it. And I don't also think that 15 years of very amateur study that I've undertaken is required either. I think it's obviously a crime against humanity. That's the Nakba. So I've very oversimplified it, and I'm going to oversimplify some more by moving right on to 19 years later. During that 19 years, the remaining 150,000 Palestinian Arabs that remained in what became Israel were ruled by martial law. There were huge restrictions on their being able to go from one village to another. Almost all large gatherings were prohibited. They had the vote. They actually did have the vote in Israel, but as you can imagine, under those conditions, having the vote had almost no effect on the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or they eventually, I guess, became citizens because martial law was eventually lifted. So they still are very much second-class citizens. For them, it's a Jim Crow type of situation, reminiscent of our own, of blacks in our own South. So I'm moving on to the Six-Day War, which is 19 years later in 1967, when Israel conquered the remainder of Palestine, and that's the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Oh, you know, I forgot to say something about this. To emphasize how tiny Palestine is. You can fit almost 6 Palestines into Missouri. And the Gaza Strip over there, that is the size of Detroit, the same square area as Detroit, although it has almost 3 times the population. Anyway, in the Six-Day War, Israel conquered the remainder of Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. So those are now the occupied Palestinian territories. They also conquered the Golan Heights from Syria. This was a very important conquest for Israel because it has much of the headwaters of the Jordan River. The Golan Heights has many waterways that empty into the Sea of Galilee, that little blue spot next to the Golan Heights, and that is that's the major feeder of the Jordan River. And Israel uses much of that river for its own uses. I guess I should also say that once they conquered the West Bank, they use 80% of the water resources of the West Bank for Israel rather than for the Palestinians in the West Bank. So I'm going to move on to 2 walls that I think are very emblematic of Palestine today, and that I think need to be torn down, just like the Berlin Wall was. So the first one is the Gaza border fence, and this is a picture of it. I don't know if it reminds you, but it certainly reminds me of a prison wall, and I think that's a very appropriate term for this wall. So let me just make a few specific remarks about the Gaza Strip. Here's a picture of that map I showed before, a corner of it, showing the destroyed and depopulated Palestinian villages, the red dots, in the vicinity of the Gaza Strip. And one of those villages is the village that Salman Abu Sita, the map maker that I mentioned before, where his family lived. And those villages were, the people from those villages were, when they were depopulated, mostly went into the Gaza Strip. So before the Nakba, there were about 80,000 Palestinians who were native to the Gaza Strip. Afterwards, they were joined by 200,000 Palestinian exiles. So the Gaza Strip's population multiplied enormously during that period. So I'm going to go skip ahead many decades to Gaza in 2014. It now has a population of 1.8 million Palestinians. And again, still about 70% of them now are the descendants of those Nakba exiles. The exiles themselves in 1948 could look at the villages that they once lived in, and they could see Israeli Jews taking over their villages, using their land, and in many cases the villages, destroying their villages. And their grandchildren now can do the same thing from the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip for a long time has been a locus of fierce resistance to the Zionist project that took their land away from them. So here it is. This is the size of Detroit. Here it is in 2014. And you can see that black border, and that represents the border fence whose a picture of which I showed earlier. Not all of it looks exactly like that, because that's kind of like the modern version of it. It hasn't all been completed. There's a little bit of it in the lower left-hand corner that's actually in Egypt. Egypt helps Israel keep the Palestinian Arabs of Gaza imprisoned. The Gaza Strip has been under blockade for 7 years after the Islamic Hamas party took took over as political rulers of the Gaza Strip. This blockade, well, what does it mean? It means partly, for example, that the airport was destroyed. Actually, it had been destroyed in 2003 by Israel. Israel has prevented a seaport being constructed. It greatly, severely restricts fishing from the Gaza Strip, which has been a mainstay of their economy and their food chain. It controls the population registry of the Gaza Strip, as well as of the West Bank, and it almost entirely prevents people from Gaza getting out to the outside world. For example, going to see their relatives in the West Bank or in Israel, or go to other places, and people going into the Gaza Strip. So human commerce has been almost entirely stopped by this blockade. Imports are extremely severely limited, and exports almost entirely prohibited. Sarah Roy, who's a Harvard economist who's made it, and she's also Jewish actually. Sarah Roy has made a study of the economy of the Gaza Strip, and she's coined a new term for Israeli economic policy toward the Gaza Strip. She calls it purposeful or intentional de-development, and that's a very good term for what's happened to the economy of the Gaza Strip, especially over the last 7 years of the blockade. And lastly, during this 7 years, Israel has launched 3 assaults against the Gaza Strip. And I just want to talk about the last of them. This is Operation Protective Edge, which occurred for 51 days during the summer of 2014. Here's a picture of rubble left behind from that assault. So let's do it by the numbers. I want to describe the numbers of this assault. So I'm going to talk about statistics for the Gazans and for the Israelis. So the weaponry available. The Gazans had no modern weaponry. They have small arms, mortars, some very primitive rockets that are just not big enough to carry a significant explosive payload. The Israelis have fighter jets that we supply, our country supplies. They have advanced bombs. They have warships with accurate artillery. They have tanks and other land-based artillery, and they have the strongest army by far in the Middle East. How about the people killed? The Gazans killed by the Israelis was over 2,000. That's 0.12% of the population. The Israelis killed by the Gazans was 73. That's 0.00117% of the Israeli population. Most of the Gazans killed by the Israelis were civilians, were non-combatants. And this is a very conservative estimate of the number that were civilians. The number of civilians killed by the Gazans was 6 out of the 73. The rest were soldiers that were invading the Gaza Strip. Children killed. The Israelis killed 550 Gazan children. The Gazans, from rockets, killed 1 child, 1 Israeli child. The Israelis damaged or destroyed 18,000 homes in the Gaza Strip. The Gazans destroyed 1 Israeli home. The people made homeless in the Gaza was 100,000. The people made homeless in Israel, maybe 10, probably not that. Places of worship. The Israelis destroyed or severely damaged 203 churches and mosques in the Gaza Strip. The Gazans destroyed or they damaged. They didn't destroy any, but they damaged 2 synagogues in Israel. The Israeli assault destroyed or damaged 285 schools. The Gazan response damaged 1 Israeli school. The Israeli assault damaged or destroyed 73 medical facilities, and none were destroyed in the Israeli side. And here's the last one, which is, I think, quite remarkable. The rubble left behind by the Israeli assault has been estimated at 2.5 million tons. And I know it's pretty hard to understand what 2.5 million tons means, and so I'm going to convert it into units that may be more understandable. 2.5 million tons is 1.75 times all the rubble left by the Twin Towers attack on September 11th, 2001. I don't think the rubble left on the Israeli side has been measured, but it's way, way less than that. So Israel calls this a Gazan war, but of course these are not the statistics of a war. They're the statistics of an assault, or maybe more appropriate, there's the statistics of a massive massacre. This is not a war. So I'm going to turn to an imaginative, a new kind of resistance that the Gazans have mounted starting last year. And this is the Great March of Return. So a whole bunch, many dozens of Gazan civil society organizations, unions, other types of organizations got together and organized an unarmed march of what they call the Great March of Return. So after prayers every Friday, tens of thousands of Gazans would come up to the border fence to protest, to make the world aware of their demands, their just demands. The demands were an end to this blockade, which has wreaked havoc and raked over the economy and the well-being of the Gaza Strip, and a recognition by Israel of their right to return to the land that their forebears were expelled from in the Nakba. That's their demands. And you can see in the foreground of this picture, I should say that, of course, Hamas, which the political ruler of the Gaza Strip, they certainly were involved, like they provided transportation and all, but this was not a Hamas event. There are no green Hamas flags. There's no green flags of the Izzeddin al-Qassam brigades, which is the military arm of Hamas. This is a civilian all the flags were Palestinian flags, and this is a civilian and an unarmed protest. You can see in the foreground here the Israeli response to this Great March of Return. There's a huge berm that they created just outside the fence, and on it were Israeli snipers, really trained snipers, and they used live ammunition to to put an end to combat this Great March of Return. After 4 months, the United Nations summarized the casualties of the Great March of Return, of Israel's response to the Great March of Return. So on the right are the deaths. They total in those first 4 months to about 160 people killed by live ammunition by these snipers. All of these protesters were unarmed. And in the blue are the casualties, and many of those casualties are also by live ammunition from the snipers. They would specifically aim at the legs, crippling injuries to the legs, making many of the victims lame for life. And even further restrictions on fishing off the Gaza Strip coast. But I told you that the Gaza Strip is a site of fierce resistance and fierce resistance to the Zionist project. And it's true. The Gazans do not learn the lessons that bullets can teach. And these Great March of Return has continued to this day, and even more casualties. Israel feels it has no choice but to, as they call it, to protect their border. The Gazan Palestinians, and in fact all Palestinians in general, are considered a demographic threat. They're the wrong kind of people to have in the nation state of the Jewish people, because Palestine is the land of the Jewish people, and the other kind of people, the wrong kind of people, have no business being there. Our government, our US government, and many other governments as well, are firmly on the side of fences. They're firmly, prison fences as I would call it, firmly on the side of the bullets. But do we, citizens of our country, have to agree with our government? Can't we protest against our government's support for this Jewish ethnic exclusivism with all the violence that it entails? So I want to move on to another wall that also needs to come down. This is the West Bank separation barrier, and here's a picture of it in Jerusalem. And yes, it snows in Jerusalem sometimes in the winter. This wall is around a Palestinian neighborhood of East Jerusalem, Shuafat. So let me just summarize the West Bank today. We've already done the Gaza Strip. I just want to talk about the West Bank today. So there are about 2.5 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank. They are mostly confined to enclaves, in the darker color here, to enclaves that together are about 40% of the land of the West Bank. They're confined there. There's checkpoints and other impediments to their traveling even from one enclave to another, especially to get to school or college. Their lives are confined in many ways. They're ruled by military law. They are under martial law. And they have absolutely no say in the government that rules their lives. Absolutely no say at all. And to know what military law is like, well, in military courts, Palestinians that come before the military court, which they do all the time, the conviction rate is 99.7%. That's military justice. There are a few Palestinians that remain in the lighter colored part of the West Bank. Oh, I should say, the lighter colored part of the West Bank. What's happened to that? Well, the lighter color of the West Bank, that's 60% of it, is filled with 200 Jewish Israeli colonies, or settlements as they're called. And they're home to about 650,000 Israeli Jews. That is about 10% of the Israeli Jewish population live in these colonies, these settlements, inside that 60% of the West Bank. Now, there are a few Palestinians, not many anymore, but a few Palestinians that do live in that 60%, alongside all those Jewish Israeli settlements or colonies. And they are being systematically and relentlessly chased off of their land in that part of the West Bank, that 60% of the West Bank, into the enclaves. So a major reason for this is that Israel refuses to recognize the legitimacy of the small Palestinian villages that remain in that 60% of the West Bank. And when they don't recognize a village, they're free to demolish the homes in it. So home demolition is a major tool that the Israelis use to expel Palestinians into those disconnected enclaves. There's another tool as well, violence by settler extremists, protected by the Israeli army. It's another major tool for expelling Palestinians. There's a relentless attack by these extremist settlers, Israeli settlers. They burn crops, they cut down olive trees, they chase herders, shepherds off land so that they no longer are able to graze their sheep or goats. So let me just summarize by saying about the West Bank that it's the West Bank today is the result of accelerated Jewish colonization and Palestinian dispossession, and it's facilitated by the Oslo Accords and the peace process, because the peace process set and trained by the Oslo Accords are what's responsible for the creation of these enclaves and the whole system of dispossession that I've just described. Finally, though, we're going to get to the wall, the separation barrier. And I use this magenta to trace out the separation barrier. Not all of it's been completed, and not all of it looks like the picture I showed before, the huge concrete slabs, one beside the other. Those concrete slabs are 25 feet high, twice the height of the Berlin Wall. But that's only around the populated parts, the heavily populated parts of the West Bank. Here's the wall in Bethlehem. On the left is a building that was bought by the British, very secretive street artist Banksy. Has anyone ever heard of Banksy? Banksy bought that building and he turned it into the walled-off hotel. I guess he couldn't call it the walled-off Astoria Hotel. He would have been sued. As you can see, the West Bank, that barrier has turned into an enormous art installation. So eat your heart out, Edwina Sands. And Banksy himself. So thousands of Palestinians have used this for artwork, and Banksy himself did. And here's one of his graffiti. Indeed, I totally agree with them. Tear down this wall and everything it stands for. So what hope is there for freedom, justice, and equality in Palestine? I mean, after all, Israel has a monopoly on coercive force. The world's only superpower, that's us, the United States, are thoroughly on the side of Zionism against freedom, justice, and equality. We give Israel their weapons, and much of them for free, constantly. We protect Israel in the United Nations. We veto any Security Council resolution that actually could have an effect on Israeli behavior. We do that routinely, and we have ever since the United Nations began. The world community, the Western world community, has been thoroughly behind the Oslo Accords and the peace process, which, as I've tried to describe, has really been a process for facilitating the dispossession of West Bank Palestinians. They've been like that across the board. The peace process and the two-state solution, another word for the same thing. It's been a program for dispossession. It's not been a program for peace, and certainly not one for justice. But I think there is hope. And one really big ray of hope comes from the Palestinians themselves. In 2005, 171 Palestinian civil society organizations, labor unions, political parties, etc., got together and issued what they called the BDS call. It was a call for the global community of conscience, maybe including in the United States, to boycott Israel, to boycott the complicit Israeli corporations and institutions, to encourage divestment in our own country from corporations like universities, from corporations that support Israeli apartheid, because this certainly is apartheid, to encourage our governments to sanction Israel. For example, for our own government, to cut off all military aid to Israel, until Israel meets three fundamental demands of international law. First, that it end its 52-year military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including that horrible blockade, that it grants full equality and citizenship to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and that it respects the Palestinian right of return to their homeland. This is the logo and their motto: freedom, justice, and equality, or words that you've already heard, and their website. And if you go to that website, you see what they mean by freedom, justice, and equality. So the BDS call, the call to us to help Palestinians in an entirely nonviolent way, the call to them, they make it clear that that call is not a call for the expulsion of Israeli Jews from Palestine. It's a call for freedom, justice, and equality for all the people who must share that Palestinian homeland. The Israeli Jews no less than the Palestinian Arabs. That is the call that that BDS makes. And if you join the BDS movement, if you pay attention to by going to their site, then you will be joining this campaign for freedom, justice, and equality. BDS and the Palestinian leadership mostly, not all, but mostly, have recast the supposed struggle in Palestine. The Israeli, the Zionist propaganda would like you to think that this is an armed nationalist struggle between Palestinian Arab nationality on the one hand and Israeli Jewish nationality on the other hand for ownership of Palestine. But that's not what this struggle is. It's a struggle between freedom, justice, and equality and their denial. So I'm going to ask you, which side are you on? Thank you. Yes, I'd be glad to take questions.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, okay, and they could be comments too. And I can't see. So if you'll have to come up to the microphone. I'm actually going to take this so I get out of the light here.
Hi, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much. My question is, so you've been talking a lot about the Jewish folk in Israeli nationality and then Palestinians. And I'm wondering, so you also mentioned the role that the Holocaust played in the creation of the nation state of Israel. And so I'm wondering if we were trying to hold the humanitarian concern of avoiding anti-Semitism and also promoting the full humanity of Palestinian folks, how might we do that?
Okay, so let me just say something about the Holocaust. The Zionist movement started at the end of the 19th century. It had nothing to do with the Holocaust, although it was there are many sources of it, but one of them is anti-Semitism, especially in the Russian Empire. So this is one of the impetuses for the Zionist movement. Another is a Jewish cultural renaissance that happened about that time, starting in the beginning of the 20th century. So this was the time when the Hebrew language, the liturgical ancient language, was reborn as a modern language, and people wrote in Hebrew. And this is a whole Hebrew literature that started around 1900 and has flourished since that time. And it was also another source of it was kind of like romantic nationalism, the idea that was very much in the air around the turn of the last century, around the First World War, of this romantic idea of people having a land that they kind of belong to. All those were the source of the Zionist project. So the Holocaust came much later, and it came just before the Nakba, I would say that the main leaders of the Zionist project in Palestine at the time, who were dead set on having a Jewish state with a large Jewish majority, they were not primarily concerned with the Holocaust, but they certainly used it as a way to get the rest of the world, especially the Western democracies, to accept what was going on in Palestine. And it was not a secret. The Nakba was not a secret at the time at all. So I think that's what I would like to say about the Holocaust. And of course, let's just point out, the Palestinian Arabs had nothing to do with the Holocaust. I mean, it would be terrible if we thought that that Jews had a right to take over Palestine because of the Holocaust, where the Palestinian Arabs would pay the price for that. That's not justice, surely.
Good morning. Thank you for coming today. I just had a few questions, and I was hoping you could help me understand. So almost immediately, and I'm not an expert on this, I really don't know, is when Israel was declared a nation state, it was invaded by Arabian nations. And you said this was not an Arab thing, but that leads me to think it was. Along with that, and I don't have all of the facts, but a few times, especially in 2000, when Israel was going to give, I think, 97% of the Gaza Strip to Palestine to become a Palestinian state, Palestine rejected and retaliated against it. Can you explain this?
Okay, well, let's take the first one first, which was the Arab armies that, in fact, I said that there were Arab armies that invaded. They invaded during the Nakba. So they invaded when the Nakba was about a third, when about a third of the ultimate number of expelled Palestinians were already expelled. They invaded when the British, which had ruled Palestine, when the last troops left on May 15th, 1948. That's when they invaded. And they invaded for a number of reasons. These troops were very no match for the Zionists, except, as I pointed out, the Arab Legion from Jordan. So that's why the Israelis made this secret agreement with the Jordanians that they wouldn't attack each other. So there was some resistance, not by the Palestinian Arabs themselves, but by these armies. But they were no match for the Zionists. The Zionists outnumbered them, and with the exception of like maybe a couple of weeks, they had a great superiority in heavy armaments, airplanes, stuff like that. So that's one. And I'm sorry, what was the second one? There was a second question, and I can't remember.
When Israel was trying, back in 2000, the Camp David summit, I think, I think 97% of the Gaza Strip.
Oh, okay, that's a really good point. This is part of the whole peace process, the whole peace process, which, as I claimed, has really been a process for dispossession. The Israeli propaganda tells you that there was this huge, generous offer made to the Palestinians. They could have all of the West Bank, and if only they would recognize Israel, and indeed the Palestinian side, the Yasser Arafat at the time, did undertake to renounce violence, and that the Palestinian leadership of the West Bank has pretty much adhered to that. They haven't mounted violence against Israel, but Israel never made such a generous offer. All such offers excluded the Jordan Valley. That was about 30% of the West Bank. Israel insisted on maintaining control of that all along. There was never any offer to abandon the West Bank, to vacate the West Bank. There's never been any generous offer, and the Israelis repeat that generous offer all the time. But historians that actually look at that, and this includes a lot, in fact, includes mostly Jewish Israeli historians, know that this is not true. This never was any such offer. And you can talk about many other offers as well. And it's true that there was a possibility of some kind of accord in 2000, in the year 2000, but it would not have been exactly a generous offer. It would have been I mean, after all, the Palestinians, in those negotiations, what was in it for the Palestinians? The Palestinians had already renounced any right or any claim on 78% of Palestine, Israel proper. They renounced that claim. They were just asking for sovereignty over the remaining 22%. And at no time did Israel offer anything like that sovereignty over the 22% of Palestine.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I want to thank you for a very illuminating discussion of a very perplexing situation. And I guess I'd like to ask you, in your judgment, is there any hope for a two-state solution in Palestine anymore? Or should we be thinking in going forward toward the creation of a unitary democratic state which would incorporate both Palestinians and Israelis or Jewish people as citizens of a single unitary state? And depending on your judgment about that, how should the United States go forward politically?
Okay, so the two-state solution, I'm going to put quotations around the solution. Those, I think, just demands of the BDS movement. One of them would be met with by the two-state solution, and that is an end to the occupation. As I've just emphasized in response to the last question, that's never been on offer by Israel. Israel has adamantly refused to end the occupation in any real sense of actually giving Palestinian sovereignty over the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But even if they did, it would leave the other two questions unanswered, the other two injustices. It would say nothing about the second-class Jim Crow status of the Israeli citizens of Israel, and of course it would say nothing about the about the exiles, The exiles now, half of the Palestinian people live outside the Palestine altogether and are not allowed back in by Israel. So it would say nothing about their right to return to their home. So I don't think it's a solution, but it's better than the present. So if it were really on offer, I think a lot of people would be, you'd say, yeah, this is not the best victory, but it's better, way better, but it's not on offer. I insist that the two-state solution is completely dead because Israel is not going to agree to it. So I do think that democracy over the entire country is the only logical thing, and I think it's also what's ultimately going to happen. This would be a modern democracy. It wouldn't be an ethnocracy favoring one particular nationality or ethnic group over another. It would be a country of the citizens. We're a country of our citizens. We're a very imperfect democracy, but Israel is fundamentally not a democracy, and I think a democracy is the only just, and it's actually, I think, the only practical ultimate outcome of what's happening in Palestine. That's my opinion. I probably won't live to see it, but maybe I will. I don't know. I mean, look, this is like South Africa. Who thought 5 years before democracy in South Africa that South Africa would be a democracy? But this is a very similar situation to apartheid South Africa. It collapsed very suddenly. Maybe Zionism will collapse in the same way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. We are out of time, I'm afraid. We need to get to our executive sessions, one in the Church of St. Mary and one in the Culture Science Center Lecture Hall. So please enjoy both of those and then come back. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you all this afternoon.